400 years and 25 minutes, we'll see. So before I share with you how history fuels my anti-racism work, I want to share some appreciations. First, I appreciate you coming here to hear a difficult topic. To those of you who've heard me speak about this before, I hope I offer you something new. To those of you who are skeptics and are worried that this will just be another case of a liberal beating up white America to ease his own guilt, that's not my intention. For those of you who are concerned that this will be a case of somebody appropriating stories of suffering, I want to say I only mean to speak for myself. While I only speak for myself, I hope myself and my consciousness and my concern and compassion are growing and becoming more inclusive. On the issue of racial justice, I try to open myself to my friends and colleagues of color who guide me and teach me and are patient with me so that I can do better work for racial justice. So I thank you. I thank all of you. You know who you are. Finally, I want to say that I'm offering my words today in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. Now, one of the challenges for any historian is that we all know that history is usually written by the winners, and winners sometimes use tactics that they want to leave out of the history books. Because of that, history can distort and can justify the power and privilege that tends to accumulate at the top of our hierarchies. But even though it's not perfect, I appreciate the discipline of history. Well-researched history grounded in facts fascinates me, liberates me from my paralyzing guilt. It helps me transform my anger and my fear and my awkwardness into more effective, albeit modestly effective, efforts at racial justice work. But this liberation, this transformation of that guilt and that awkwardness comes at a price. And the price is that I have to try to figure out a paradox that is at the heart of the American story. This is the paradox. For about 400 years, the colonies and the nation that arose from them simultaneously constructed both an unparalleled culture of opportunity and idealism, as well as a brutally based, racially based system of oppression. So side by side grew both democracy dedicated to the ideals of equality and justice, as well as a racism so tenacious that it stayed with us through slavery and Jim Crow and into today's racially biased justice and incarceration systems. And this paradox is so striking that sometimes we stop trying to understand it, yearning for the comfort of a unquestioned historical pride, perhaps. I want that. I fall into denial. Historian Ann Farrow says, the hard question of how a post-Enlightenment nation founded on principles of personal liberty became the largest holder of slaves in the Western world is still before us, still waiting to be answered. Answering this question requires us to meet President Obama's challenge when he spoke last March, asking, are we strong enough to be self-critical, to remake this nation to more closely align with our highest ideals? I hope we are. Hope was the dominant theme of President Obama's 2008 campaign. It's also the middle name of a historian that inspires me, John Hope Franklin. He died 5 years ago, but lived long enough to see the election of the first African-American president, something that he thought he'd never believed he'd see. But he could imagine it because of how he was raised. He could imagine it because his parents insisted that he was the equal of any other human being. His mother told him that to answer the question, what do you want to be when you grow up, by saying the first Negro president of the United States. With such an answer, she said, you won't be crying, you'll be defining. So Franklin did define the odds to become one of the most preeminent historians in the United States. His book, From Slavery to Freedom, was an important part of my college education. Drew Gilpin-Faust of the New York Times wrote last month, Franklin, the scholar, unearthed reams of new facts no one had bothered to look up previously. Facts buried in archives, newspapers, and government records. Facts no historians searched for until history decided Black Lives Matter. Faust noted that Franklin's incredible dedication to objectivity existed even while delving into a history that challenges objectivity. I mean, how can you be objective about lynching, for example? But Franklin checked his emotions and said that, quote, polemics and diatribes should not pollute his scholarship. This isn't easy in a world more interested in comfort than truth. This is not easy writing for an audience that is eager for an affirming national story. That's what the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights wanted, an affirming national story, when they contracted with Hope Franklin to write a civil rights history in honor of the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation in the 60s. When he gave them his first draft, they criticized it for being too attentive to the fact that racial justice moves slowly. They wanted him to pretty up the history, as he said. But he couldn't do that. It's very easy for history to avoid ugly truths. Anne Farrow's book, The Log Books, that my son gave me for Christmas, goes into that. It's called The Log Books, Connecticut's Slaves, Ships, and Human Memory. And in it, the author weaves a story of her own mother's losing battle against dementia with the story of our national amnesia. She explores how memory, how people forget, and how nations suffer from collective amnesia, and how we rewrite history to make it more comfortable. Many in the United States a century ago were very uncomfortable with the fact that a rising black middle class was beginning to compete, that blacks were migrating from southern plantations to northern cities, because this threatened traditional white privilege in many ways. So they turned to the distortions of the Dunning School of historians. Trained at Columbia University by Professor William A. Dunning, they portrayed post-Civil War advancement by blacks as misguided and dangerous. They claimed, quote, from a book by Dunning, Congress took the freedoms and rights from qualified whites and gave them to unqualified blacks who were being duped by their corrupt carpetbagger and scallywag allies. Now sadly, one of ethical culture's own historians, David Seville Muzzy, also distorted history. My ethical humanist leaders and I have been discussing on our listserv recently his History of the American People, which was throughout a lot of high schools in America decades ago, in which he smeared Reconstruction-era African American leaders. He exaggerates the flaws of black leaders, painting them all as manipulated and dishonest and incapable. In one passage, Muzzy writes, in the exhausted states already amply punished by the desolation of war, he's talking about the South, they're already amply punished, the rule of the Negro and his unscrupulous carpetbagger and scallywag patrons was an orgy of extravagance, fraud, and disgusting incompetency. This interpretation, which is shared, by the way, in the most popular film in the United States of the earliest 20th century, The Birth of a Nation, helped block efforts to offer economic opportunities and educational opportunities to people of color. These arguments were drawn up again and again that cut funding for those services and opportunities. The Dunning School of Historians gave ample ammunition to people fighting the civil rights efforts in the 50s and 60s. Now I know most of you have a pretty good sense of our historical hypocrisy. There's a huge gap in this country between the ideals we proclaim and sometimes advance for the good of everybody, but there's still a huge gap between those ideals and some of our sordid history. This is the history that I appreciated when I read Lerone Bennett's Before the Mayflower, which is a title marking the first time Africans were brought against their will to the English colonies. 1619, 1 year before the Pilgrims. In 3 years, we're going to mark a most odious history. It'll be the 400th anniversary of the first time Africans were brought to this country. In honor of that anniversary, I'm going to begin a project today, leading up to that anniversary, that I'm calling 400 Years. It's a project where I'm going to try to offer support and material for people wanting to do anti-racism work, particularly people who consider themselves racially privileged. Like my talk today, 400 Years is going to use history, the history of our organized, massive slave trade, the 12.5 million human beings that were bought and packaged in African slaving outposts called factories. They brought immense profits. Most of you know the brutality of the Middle Passage. Men, women, and children were kidnapped from their homeland, separated from their families, and put into foul-smelling, floating prisons with pretty names. Pretty names like Charming Susanna, or the Swallow, or the Greyhound. Poet Robert Hayden said that their bright, ironical names were like jests of kindness on a murderer's mouth. One historian suggested that we simply consider the slave ships instruments of torture. Africans were stripped, chained, packed closely together. Henry Smithman, who was visiting Sierra Leone in the 1770s, wrote in his diary, "Alas, what a scene of misery and distress is a full-slaved ship in the rains. The clanking of chains, the groans of the sick, and the stench of the whole. 2 or 3 slaves thrown overboard every day, dying of fever flux, missiles, worms, altogether, all the day the chains rattled." Those who survived the Middle Passage entered the living hell of the Caribbean and South American plantations, where they suffered from abdominal swelling and skin lesions and convulsions and diarrhea and dysentery, whooping cough, and more. And those lucky enough to survive, and I use the term lucky ironically, were then shipped as seasoned labor to the English colonies. It was still cheaper in the 1700s to import new slaves than raise them from birth until working age. When they were working, they were routinely whipped, they were branded, raped, castrated. Plantation farms harvested rice and indigo and cotton from sunrise to sunset. Slaves lived in shacks, eating unhealthy, high-calorie foods, and were subject to something called the pushing system, which enforced quotas with violence. And so profitable was the slaves at the eve of the Civil War, there were about 1.2 million living in this country. By that time, most had been born in this land of liberty. Now, slave narratives that weren't really read until about 100 years ago detail the perverse brutality of slavery, but also the unique ingenuity of slaves who used their intelligence to survive. After the Civil War, despite their intelligence, leaders like W.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and Frederick Douglass had to navigate the realities of Jim Crow. They had to deal with the unfulfilled promises of democracy. And it's a testament to them that despite being torn in two by this, they were still able to have hope for the future and self-respect. Most blacks at the start of the 20th century, however, were more concerned about just not getting lynched, because the start of the 20th century was the most violent part of this country's history that a lot of people don't know about. Certainly lynchings were at their highest. Take, for example, the East St. Louis riots. Marcus Garvey called this one of the bloodiest outrages against mankind. In 1917, 3,000 whites attacked blacks in St. Louis. 2 white police officers were then killed in the scuffles. White rioters proceeded to shoot anywhere from 40 to 200 blacks, depending on who you read. Then they cut the fire department's water hose, proceeded to burn down black neighborhoods, leaving 6,000 homeless. 4 years later, Tulsa, Oklahoma, a little better known, a white mob rioted for 16 hours. They burned 35 blocks of the wealthiest black community in the United States, leaving 10,000 people homeless. 800 blacks received treatment in 2 remaining area hospitals. Numerous witnesses described airplanes dropping firebombs on black neighborhoods. Officially, 38 blacks were killed, but some records indicate the real total was 300. So violence and discrimination continued for decades, you know this, up through the 60s, to the high watershed mark of the civil rights movement. And for me, growing up at that point, it was all about Martin Luther King, who was inspired by history. By the history of Thoreau, of Gandhi, of C. Van Woodward in his 1955 book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, which King said was the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement achieved some success due to the disciplined, nonviolent activists who were willing to suffer, to bring the suffering from racism onto their own bodies. Provoking reactions, King and his peaceful revolutionaries took on the suffering of the world and began to change this culture a little bit. And success soon lapsed into mourning with each death, from Emmett Till to Medgar Evers, to Cheney, Goodman, Schwerner, Malcolm X. But what hit the hardest in my life was the death of Martin Luther King Jr. This nonviolent, shining example of love overcoming hate, slain by an assassin's bullet, affected me deeply. And his death became infused in my 25 years of teaching history to young people, this feeble attempt to try to explain man's inhumanity to man. Now, despite such inhumanity, James Baldwin in The Fire Next Time managed to urge his 14-year-old nephew to transcend the cycles of violence and rise to a higher way of being. 50 years later, it's harder for Ta-Nehisi Coates to remain hopeful when speaking to his own son in his book, Between the World and Me. Hope is harder for anyone who reads Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, that details the systemic racial oppression that never left America. It just changed forms. Now, for now, I'm going to stop this very brief foray into America's history of racial oppression. And I know some of you are thinking probably what a New England historian told Anne Farrow when she was working on her book about slave trading, the log books. He said, "Anne, people already know this." Well, they do and they don't, because there are different ways of knowing. I mean, most Americans know the outline of our history of slavery, but we tend to minimize it because it's so overwhelming. I mean, I'm as guilty of this as anyone. I grew up believing the classic Yankee narrative that slavery was a product of the evil South, that slavery in the North was rare and relatively benign, and that Northern blacks were free from the scathing racism of the rural South. None of that is true, of course, but children are easily fooled. So what about college students? Are they any better? Can you fool them as easily? A couple of months ago, I read an article about a controversy at my alma mater, Yale. It's one of a number of ugly controversies right now floating there. This was a story about the names of one of its residential colleges, Calhoun College. Now, as an undergraduate history major, specializing in U.S. history, I knew of John C. Calhoun, the South Carolina senator who argued that slavery was a positive good. But I didn't realize that John C. Calhoun was also a Yale valedictorian for whom this residential college was named. As a student, it did not occur to me that these two Calhouns were one and the same. I never really thought about it. And that's my point. I didn't have to. The honorific naming of a college for one of our nation's most powerful white supremacists was something that a privileged son could overlook. Overlooking it is harder for Maya Jenkins, who is a sophomore at Yale right now, and a member of Calhoun College. She eats her breakfast under a stained glass window depicting John C. Calhoun. Eerily, there is a panel that was taken out a couple of years ago that had a slave with a chain on his neck. It's probably not easy for Maya Jenkins to ignore the fact that the heads of each of those Yale colleges have the name, the title, Master. Now, I suppose I knew growing up that Master was an obnoxious thing to ask a person of color to call somebody. I should have known that since my father was Master of Davenport College. But when he became dean of the undergraduate school, the master title went, and I just wrote it off to tradition. That term was all way in the past, so I thought. But the ironies just keep piling up because the current dean, Jonathan Holloway, the first African-American dean of Yale College, was also a master at Yale College, and he was master of, you guessed it, Calhoun College. I sort of admire Holloway's description of the situation as deliciously ironic, but I can't admire my own lack of awareness of what my classmates of color must have seen every day. What was invisible to me and what's invisible to much of New England where I grew up is our historical investment in slavery. It was an investment that Anne Farrow didn't know about until she found the logbook of a young Dudley Saltonstall. Now the Saltonstalls are a powerful family with deep Connecticut roots, and he was on slave ships. The logbooks led Farrow to discover that many, many slaves lived and worked in New England, but they were listed in their town records as servants. Farrow discovered that 90% of the ships bringing slaves to the southern colonies were owned by New Englanders. Farrow discovered that the mills of New England processed tons of slave-ground cotton, and the northern forges made the shackles, the cotton gins, the carriages, the farm equipment of plantation life. Bernard Bailyn, a colonial historian, called slavery the key dynamic force that propelled New England to early prosperity. New England banks swelled with cotton money. But I, like a lot of New England in general, grew up suffering from historical amnesia. We had what Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Robert Penn Warren scathingly criticized as a mistaken and unshakable notion of our own blamelessness. Warren correctly observed that when one is happy in forgetfulness, facts get forgotten. So while everybody knows about slavery, facts are forgotten. But more importantly, a profound processing of our historical reality still has yet to make it into the heart of our national narrative. Many people say that slavery was a sad chapter in American history. But Farrow says this. She says, slavery was not the sad chapter in an otherwise glorious trajectory. Slavery was not a chapter of the book, but the book itself. Our nation's form of hereditary bondage was the cornerstone of our making, our creation. Until we admit this, the wounds remain open. Farrow says that when trauma is denied, the suffering of its descendants becomes worse. Amnesia does hurt. What is the solution? Ta-Nehisi Coates in The World Between the World and Me says that history can help us overcome our national forgetfulness. He says that slavery was not ancillary to American history, but foundational, and that it remains a ghost alive in contemporary America, haunting us with a legacy of unequal education, housing, and opportunities for people of color. Slavery is more than a ghost. It's embodied in a friend of mine in the Washington Ethical Society that I've mentioned here before, Dan Smith. Dan Smith's father was born a slave. You can do the math. I'll tell you later. It's not that long ago. It's alive. It's here. So is it more than just forgetfulness? Just last month up in the Collier Gallery, a group from Temple University were filming a project that they called Racists Anonymous. I'm waiting to see the video. Hopefully we'll see it here. They describe racism as an addiction because it leads us to be powerless and leads us into denial and irrationality. Maybe racism is an illness, which is what photographer Tanishka Smith told me last month. She's the driving force behind a project that's on my door called Racism is a Sickness. Through photos and stories of people's earliest difficult experiences with race, she is trying to heal racism through dialogue. You can come with me to see the exhibit on February 23rd. Martin Luther King Jr. described racism as an infected boil festering in our civic body. But maybe we should admit that it's not an isolated boil, but it is a disease running through the lifeblood of our country. It needs a more dramatic cure. And this cure has to be more than symbols. It can't just be about taking down Confederate flags. It has to be about changing the future in real, concrete ways. John Hope Franklin wanted history, he wrote, to rehabilitate our nation. He said that challenging the hallowed past was, quote, the necessary condition for the changing the present and the future. Might a form of truth and reconciliation help us transcend the current prison-industrial complex, or racially biased policing, or urban decay, or lawless streets? Can we study history to build justice? Franklin urged us to confront our past and to see it for what it is. To confront our past and to see it for what it is. The Times reporter Faust commented, "The past is, not the past was. The past lives on. Only if we understand and acknowledge this past can we grapple with the conflicts of the present and the promises of the future." The past does live on. It lives on in the celebrations and the service that are happening tomorrow in honor of Martin Luther King. But King was also a master community organizer, which is one reason why the importance of leveraging political power and marshaling coalitions is what is at the heart of POWER, the group that we joined, Philadelphians Organizing to Witness, Empower, and Rebuild. And the Ethical Society joined POWER to try to make a difference. In honor of Martin Luther King Day tomorrow, they're holding a leadership assembly from 4 to 6 at the Arch Street United Methodist Church, 55 North Broad Street. Join me there. Many of our members are going to be there. Mayor Kenny said he was going to be there. Many of our allies from churches, mosques, and synagogues are going to be there. We're going to be there to tell the new mayor that we are there to support his work on racial justice issues. Please tell Kate Esposito we're going to be there so we know our number. Kate, where's your hand? Right. Let her know. Beyond tomorrow, consider working with the groups that are trying to end the violence that's destroying so many of our African American neighborhoods. You can check out some of the organizations that Linda Richardson shared with me, including Mothers in Charge, Father's Day Rally Committee, Men United for a Better Philadelphia, the Frederick Heroux Institute, the Institute for Development of African American Youth, Frontline Dads, Ex-Offenders for Community Empowerment, where you can talk to Xavier about his work. But if you're not ready to act yet, if you need inspiration like I often do, I just give you this very simple advice. Know the history, tell the truth. Know the history, tell the truth. Read any of the books that I mentioned today. They're on a handout that are in your program. Read Nick Sanders' President's Column in our latest newsletter, where he talks about his journey up to and into the new Jim Crow. Fuel your anti-racism with history. 400 years is a long time. It should be long enough to know that we have to use the history to build justice. Thank you very much.